On June 14th, Frank Miller received a $150 fine, not for noise, weeds, or an illegal fence, but for building a ramp to access his own front door. It was 7 inches of concrete that started it all, a single HOA-compliant step that stood between a disabled veteran and the dignity of getting home without a fight. For Frank, who once built bridges in war zones with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the ramp was basic engineering. For the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, it was an unapproved structure made of the wrong kind of wood. That fine was just the first volley. What followed was a battle far more personal than anything Frank faced overseas, one fought not with bullets or bureaucracy, but with pride, neighbors, and a quiet, inflexible set of bylaws. By the time the keys hit the asphalt under his truck, the war had officially begun. One particularly humid Tuesday in June, after a frustrating trip to the VA for a physical therapy appointment, Frank dropped a bag of oranges. They scattered across the driveway like bright orange billiard balls. As he sat there, panting in the heat, watching a perfectly ripe Valencia orange roll under his truck, something inside him snapped. It wasn't a loud, angry break, but a quiet, decisive click. "That's it," he muttered to the empty street. "I'm done with this." He wasn't just done with the step. He was done with feeling helpless. He was an engineer, for God's sake. He built bridges in places where the world was actively trying to blow them up. He could certainly conquer 7 inches of American concrete. That evening, he called the one man he knew would understand, Dave "Wreck-It" Riley, his former platoon sergeant, now running a construction business a few towns over. "Wreck-It, it's Frank." "Frankie boy, don't tell me you broke something else. The VA's going to start charging you for replacement parts." Dave boomed through the phone, his voice a familiar, comforting gravel. Frank chuckled. "Not this time. I need to build a ramp. Front porch." Dave didn't ask why. He didn't need to. "You got plans?" "In my head," Frank said. "Simple, sturdy, nothing fancy. Just needs to get me from the walkway to the porch." "Say no more. I'll bring the lumber and a beer. You supply the drill and the bad jokes. Saturday or 800? "You got it, Sarge." That Saturday was a slice of the life Frank missed. The air was filled with the scent of sawdust and the easy banter of 2 men who had trusted each other with their lives. Dave, a mountain of a man with a soft heart, did the heavy lifting and sawing, while Frank, perched on a stool, measured cuts, drilled pilot holes, and drove screws with the precision of a surgeon. They worked with an unspoken rhythm, a testament to years of shared purpose. They didn't talk about Iraq. They didn't have to. It was there in the efficiency of their movements, in the shorthand of their speech, in the quiet understanding that this wasn't just a construction project. It was an act of reclamation. By mid-afternoon, it was done. A solid, unadorned ramp made of pressure-treated plywood and 4x4 posts. It wasn't painted. It didn't have fancy railings. It was purely functional, a pale greenish wood structure that stood in stark contrast to the neighborhood's curated perfection. Dave slapped a post. "Solid as a rock, my friend." Frank looked at it, then at his wheelchair parked on the driveway. He transferred into the chair, rolled to the base of the ramp, and with a smooth, effortless push, ascended the gentle slope. He reached the porch, his wheels silent on the wood, and turned to face his handiwork. He was no longer looking up at his own front door. He was meeting it on equal terms, A wave of relief and pride washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to tears. "Thank you, Dave," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Any time, Frankie, any time." For a week, life was different. Frank came and went with ease. He retrieved his mail without a second thought. He took out the trash without a strategic planning session. The ramp was more than wood and screws. It was freedom. It was dignity. Then the letter arrived. It came in a cream-colored envelope, thick and expensive feeling, with the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association logo embossed in forest green at the top. His name and address were printed in a crisp, impersonal font. He slid it open with his thumb, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The letter was brief and brutally clear. "Dear Mr. Miller, this letter serves as a formal notice of a violation of the Willow Creek Estates community bylaws. An unapproved structure, a ramp, has been erected on your property at 1245 Willow Lane. This structure is in violation of the following covenants. Bylaw 7.4.2, approved building materials. All exterior structures must be constructed from approved materials, e.g., composite decking, finished cedar. Pressure-treated plywood is not a permitted material for visible surfaces. Bylaw 8.1.1, architectural review. All exterior modifications must be submitted to and approved by the Architectural Review Committee, ARC, prior to the commencement of any work. You are hereby assessed a fine of $50 borough. You have 14 days from the date of this letter to submit a plan to the ARC for a compliant structure and to remove the unapproved ramp. Failure to comply will result in further fines. Sincerely, the Willow Creek Estates HOA Board." Frank read it twice. He looked from the cold, sterile words to the sturdy, functional ramp that had given him back a piece of his life. A weary sigh escaped his lips. The man who had faced down insurgents and navigated minefields now had to wage a war against the Architectural Review Committee. The mountain wasn't the step after all. It was the neighborhood. Frank's first instinct was the soldier's instinct: assess the enemy, understand the terrain, and form a plan of attack. But the enemy wasn't a sniper in a window. It was a faceless entity called the Architectural Review Committee. The terrain wasn't a dusty street in Fallujah. It was a user-unfriendly website portal that seemed designed to induce despair. He spent an hour trying to navigate the HOA's online system. He found the Violations tab, clicked on Appeal, and was met with a text box that allowed a maximum of 500 characters. How could he possibly explain his life, his leg, the daily indignity of that single step in 500 characters? It was like trying to describe a symphony with a single note. He did his best, writing a short, factual message explaining his disability and the necessity of the ramp. He attached a scanned copy of his VA disability ID card and hit Submit. The response was instantaneous and automated. "Thank you for your submission. The committee will review your appeal at the next scheduled meeting. Please allow 4-6 weeks for a response." 4 to 6 weeks. To them, it was a bureaucratic timeline. To him, it was a month and a half of uncertainty, with the threat of more fines hanging over his head. His next-door neighbor, Brenda, saw the ramp the day after it was built and had come over immediately, not with a complaint, but with a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies. Brenda was a retired cardiac nurse in her late 60s, a widow with a sharp mind and a kind heart. Her lawn was just as perfect as everyone else's, but there was a warmth to her home that defied the HOA's sterile uniformity. "That's the smartest thing I've seen on this street in years, Frank," she'd said, nodding at the ramp. "It's about time." When Frank told her about the letter, she let out an unladylike snort. "Oh, for heaven's sake, it's always something with them. Last year they tried to fine the Hendersons because their garden gnome was 2 inches too tall." 2 inches? I think they walk around with tape measures. "It's the principle of the thing, Bren," Frank said, rubbing his temples. "It's not just a ramp." "I know what it is, dear," she said softly. "It's your independence. Don't you let them take it from you." A few days later, a second cream-colored envelope appeared. This one felt heavier, more ominous. "Dear Mr. Miller, your appeal regarding the violation at 1245 Willow Lane has been reviewed and denied. The committee finds that the necessity of a ramp does not supersede the established architectural standards of the community. Furthermore, as the 14-day grace period has expired, you are in a state of failure to cure violation. An additional fine of $100 has been assessed, bringing your total outstanding balance to $150. The structure is now also in violation of Bylaw 9.1.5, Aesthetic Harmony. The design is not in keeping with the community's established architectural theme. You have 7 days to remove the non-compliant structure. Legal action may be initiated if compliance is not achieved." The words "legal action" jumped off the page. Frank crumpled the letter in his fist, the paper crackling in protest. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was a threat. He was sitting on his porch, staring at the offending ramp, when he saw it. A gleaming black Lexus sedan, cruising slowly down the street. The driver was a man in his mid-60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a crisp polo shirt. As the car passed Frank's house, the driver slowed down even more, his gaze lingering on the ramp. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face before accelerating away. Brenda, who was watering her petunias, walked over to Frank's driveway. "That's Richard Davenport," she whispered, as if saying his name too loudly might incur a fine. "HOA president, lives in the big house on the corner, thinks he's the king of Willow Creek." Seeing the man behind the letters, the face of his frustration, crystallized something for Frank. This wasn't a faceless committee. It was a person who looked at his ramp not as a tool for a disabled veteran, but as a blemish on his perfect kingdom. That afternoon, a new player entered the game. Leo, Brenda's 17-year-old grandson, was visiting for the summer. He was a lanky, energetic kid with a shock of black hair and fingers that seemed permanently attached to his smartphone. He'd seen Frank's ramp and thought it was awesome. When Brenda explained the situation, Leo's eyes lit up with the fire of teenage justice. "That's messed up, Mr. Miller," Leo said, leaning against the porch railing. "They can't do that, can they? Like, isn't there a law? The ADA or something?" "It's complicated, Leo," Frank said. "HOAs have their own set of rules." "Let me see," Leo said, pulling out his phone. In 90 seconds, he had bypassed the clunky public portal and found a cached version of the HOA's full, unredacted bylaws, along with a list of the board members. "Okay, so here's the thing. Mr. Davenport is the president. The other two on the architectural committee are his buddies from the golf club. And the bylaws are super vague on purpose. They use words like harmonious and in keeping with, which can mean whatever they want. Leo's quick-witted navigation through the digital world gave Frank an idea. He had been trying to fight this war on their terms, through their channels. It was time to change the rules of engagement. Anger and legal threats wouldn't work with a man like Davenport. That would just make him dig in his heels. Frank needed a different weapon. He looked at the crumpled letter in his hand, then at the ramp, then at the big house on the corner where the king lived. He wasn't going to write another appeal. He wasn't going to hire a lawyer, not yet. He was going to send an invitation. "Leo," Frank said, a new glint in his eye, "how good are you at writing a really polite, professional-sounding email?" "The best," Leo said with a grin. "Suck-up level or just like regular polite?" "Make it sound like I'm asking for his wisdom," Frank said, a slow, strategic smile spreading across his face. "Make it sound like I respect his authority. We're not going to fight him, Leo. We're going to show him." The email was a masterpiece of strategic courtesy. Frank dictated the substance, and Leo polished the language, ensuring it struck the perfect tone. Deferential yet firm, respectful but not subservient. It was sent directly to Richard Davenport's personal email address, which Leo had procured through what he vaguely described as internet magic. Subject: a community matter at 1245 Willow Lane. "Dear Mr. Davenport, my name is Frank Miller, your neighbor at 1245 Willow Lane. I am writing to you directly, not to appeal the recent board decisions, but in the hope of seeking your guidance as president of our HOA and as a respected member of our community. I understand the board's position regarding the architectural standards that make Willow Creek such a desirable place to live. I recognize that the ramp I constructed does not meet these high standards. However, it meets a significant and immediate need for me. Rather than engage in a formal and impersonal dispute process, I was hoping you might be willing to grant me a few minutes of your time. I would like to invite you to my home for a cup of coffee to discuss the matter in person. I believe that a neighborly conversation might help me understand the board's perspective better and perhaps help me find a solution that works for everyone. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Frank Miller." From his leather-upholstered home office, Richard Davenport read the email on his 27-inch iMac screen. He read it twice. He had been expecting a furious, litigious response, or perhaps radio silence, followed by a lawyer's letterhead. This was unexpected. The man was being reasonable. He was acknowledging the violation and asking for guidance. Davenport felt a swell of satisfaction. This is how it should be. The system works. A firm hand leads to compliance. He pictured the man, this Miller, probably an obstinate old fellow who had finally seen the light. A personal visit would be the perfect way to cap this off, to deliver a firm but fatherly lecture on the importance of rules, and then graciously grant him an extension. "Of course," he typed back, a magnanimous smile on his face. "I would be happy to stop by. How is tomorrow at 2 Saur p.m.? The next day, promptly at 2 Saur p.m., Davenport's black Lexus purred to a stop at the curb. He emerged, looking every bit the part of a successful executive. Tailored khaki trousers, a navy blue polo shirt with a golf club logo, and expensive Italian loafers. He walked up the driveway with a confident stride, his eyes fixed on the unpainted ramp as if it were a personal affront. Frank was waiting for him at the door, having opened it from the inside. He was dressed simply in jeans and a gray t-shirt. "Mr. Davenport, thank you for coming," Frank said, his voice even. "Richard, please," Davenport said, extending a hand for a firm, business-like shake. "Happy to chat." He glanced past Frank into the house, expecting to be led to a kitchen table for the aforementioned coffee. "I appreciate that, Richard," Frank said. "Actually, the coffee can wait. I was just about to head out for some groceries. I was wondering if you'd mind tagging along. It won't take long." Davenport was taken aback. This was not on his agenda. "Groceries?" he asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. "Yeah," Frank said, already turning his wheelchair toward the ramp. "It'll give us a chance to talk. You can see what my day-to-day is like. It might provide some context." Thrown off his game, Davenport found himself agreeing before he could think of a polite way to refuse. He followed Frank down the ramp, noting with some irritation how much space it took up, and watched the laborious process of Frank transferring from his wheelchair into the driver's seat of his truck. He then had to disassemble the chair and heave its frame and wheels into the extended cab. By the time Frank was ready to go, his face was glistening with sweat, and his breathing was heavy. Davenport, who had been standing awkwardly on the sidewalk, felt a flicker of something uncomfortable. Pity, perhaps. The trip to the supermarket was an exercise in silent observation. Davenport sat in the passenger seat of the truck, the cab smelling faintly of coffee and hard work. At the store, he watched the entire process in reverse. The assembly of the chair, the transfer, the careful navigation through the automatic doors. Inside, the world was built for people who could stand. Davenport, a man of purpose and efficiency, usually strode through these aisles, grabbing what he needed without a thought. Frank's journey was a different story. He had to plan his route to avoid the promotional display that was blocking half the aisle. He had to ask a stockboy to get a can of beans from the top shelf, a request that was met with an exasperated sigh. When he got to the dairy case, he couldn't quite reach the milk at the back and had to wait for another shopper to pass by to ask for help. Davenport watched it all. He saw the looks from other people, some of pity, some of impatience, most of simple invisibility, as if Frank and his chair didn't exist. He was just an obstacle in their path. Davenport was a man who prized control, and what he was witnessing was a life of constant grinding dependency on the environment and the kindness of strangers. He had always seen the world as a place of rules and results. You follow the rules, you get good results. Simple. But here, in the bright, cold light of the grocery store, he was seeing a man for whom the rules didn't apply. The world wasn't built for him. For the first time, Richard Davenport began to understand that Frank's ramp wasn't an act of defiance against the HOA's rules. It was an act of defiance against a world that wasn't designed for him. It wasn't an eyesore. It was a tool, a necessary, vital tool for a man trying to live a normal life. And Richard Davenport, in his quest to enforce one set of rules, was actively trying to take that tool away. The thought landed with a quiet, sickening thud in the pit of his stomach. The drive back from the grocery store was quiet. The easy confidence Richard Davenport had arrived with had evaporated, replaced by a dense, contemplative silence. The typical afternoon traffic and talk radio filled the cab of the truck, but the space between the two men was charged with unspoken thoughts. Davenport kept glancing from the road to Frank's hands on the steering wheel, then to the specialized controls that allowed him to drive without his left foot. He was seeing not just a neighbor, but a man of profound adaptation, a man who had re-engineered his entire life around a loss that Davenport could barely comprehend. They pulled into Frank's driveway. The routine began again, the engine off, the painstaking transfer from the truck to the pre-assembled wheelchair. Frank handled the grocery bags first, setting them on the porch. Then he turned to go back to the truck to grab his wallet and phone from the console. As he maneuvered the chair, his hand brushed against the side pocket of his cargo pants. A faint metallic jingle was the only warning. His keys, a simple ring with keys for his house, his truck, and a small worn brass key for a footlocker he hadn't opened in years, slipped from his pocket. They didn't just fall to the pavement. They hit the asphalt with a clatter and skittered with the cruel precision of fate directly under the truck, coming to rest near the center of the undercarriage. Frank stared at the spot where they had disappeared, and a long, slow sigh escaped him. It was not a sigh of anger, but of pure, bottomless exhaustion. It was the sound of a man facing one more battle in a war that never ended. Davenport, witnessing the small mishap, reacted instinctively. He was a problem solver, a man of action. "Oh, let me get that for you," he said, already taking a step forward, ready to crouch down and solve this simple problem. "I've got it." Frank's voice was quiet, but it had the unmistakable steel of a command. It stopped Davenport in his tracks. He stood frozen on the walkway, a guest who had just overstepped a deeply personal boundary. What followed was the most excruciating and illuminating 2 minutes of Richard Davenport's life. He didn't watch a man pick up his keys. He watched an engineer solve a complex physics problem. Frank rolled his chair as close to the side of the truck as he could. He locked the brakes. He leaned forward, his face tight with concentration, trying to see the keys in the deep shadow. They were too far. He rolled back, unlocked the brakes, and repositioned the chair at a different angle. Still no good. He let out another controlled breath and reached for a long claw-like grabbing tool attached to the side of his wheelchair. He extended the tool, his arm muscles straining as he held it out. He carefully maneuvered the claw under the truck, his movement slow and deliberate. The claw was inches from the keys. He squeezed the handle. The metal jaws closed, but they only grazed the keyring, pushing it an inch further away. Davenport could feel his own muscles tensing in sympathy. He wanted to shout, "Just let me help you!" But he held his tongue, captivated by the raw, unvarnished display of grit. This wasn't a performance for his benefit. This was just Frank's life. Frank tried again. He adjusted his angle, his brow furrowed. He extended the tool, his knuckles white. This time, he managed to hook one of the metal claws into the key ring. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to drag it toward him. The key scraped against the grimy asphalt, the sound echoing in the silent driveway. After what felt like an eternity, he pulled the ring clear of the truck. He picked it up and placed it in his lap, his shoulders slumping for a fraction of a second in relief. He looked up and met Davenport's eyes. He saw no pity in the man's face. He saw shock, He saw understanding. He saw for the first time a flicker of profound respect. The wall of rules and regulations, of bylaws and fines, had been obliterated by the simple, terrible weight of a dropped key. The ramp, gleaming in the afternoon sun, no longer looked like a violation. It looked like a victory. It was the difference between the agonizing 2-minute struggle he had just witnessed and a simple, dignified arrival home. They were silent for a long moment. Finally, Davenport cleared his throat, his voice raspy. Was it? He couldn't bring himself to finish the question, but he didn't need to. Frank's gaze became distant. He looked past his perfect lawn, past the identical houses, to a place thousands of miles and a lifetime away. Iraq, 2007, a roadside bomb just outside Ramadi, he said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. I was the lucky one on my team. Davenport simply nodded. The words, "Thank you for your service," felt cheap and hollow now. What could he possibly say? He had been fining this man, threatening him with legal action because his tool of survival wasn't the right color. The absurdity of it, the shame of it, washed over him. He looked at the ramp, then back at Frank. "I understand," he said, and the words were not a platitude. They were a confession. "Thank you for the coffee, Frank." As Richard Davenport walked back to his gleaming Lexus, he was a different man than the one who had arrived an hour earlier. He wasn't the king of Willow Creek anymore. He was just Frank Miller's neighbor, and he knew he had a meeting to run. The weekly HOA board meeting was held in the Willow Creek Community Clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls, uncomfortable chairs, and the faint scent of chlorine from the nearby pool. The usual dozen or so residents were in attendance, a mix of retirees with time on their hands, and a few younger couples who had run afoul of the committee for leaving their trash cans out for too long. There was a low murmur of anticipation. The Miller Ramp issue, as it had been dubbed on the community forum, was on the agenda. Everyone expected fireworks. They expected Richard Davenport, a staunch defender of property values and aesthetic harmony, to bring the hammer down. Davenport sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other two board members. He called the meeting to order, his voice calm and measured. He went through the standard business, the treasurer's report, the landscaping committee's update on seasonal plantings. Then he paused, folded his hands, and looked out at the small crowd. "The next item on the agenda," he began, "is the outstanding violation at 1245 Willow Lane, the residence of Mr. Frank Miller." He saw a few people lean forward, ready for the drama. "Regarding this issue," Davenport continued, his voice gaining strength, "I am officially withdrawing all notices of violation and rescinding all fines levied against Mr. Miller." A collective gasp went through the room. Brenda, sitting in the back row with Leo, broke into a wide smile. "Furthermore," Davenport said, holding up a hand to forestall the inevitable questions, "I would like to offer a public apology on behalf of this board to Mr. Miller. Not just for the letters and the fines, but for a profound failure on our part to see a neighbor in need." He then did something no one expected. He told them the story. He didn't embellish or dramatize it. He just told them, simply and honestly, about the trip to the grocery store. He told them about the dropped keys. He described in detail the quiet, 2-minute struggle he had witnessed in the driveway. "We have a man living in our community," Davenport said, his voice thick with emotion, who faces a dozen such struggles every single day, struggles we can't even imagine. And what has been our response? To measure the color of the wood he used to make his life a fraction easier, to fine him for it. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his neighbors. He saw shame, surprise, and dawning comprehension on their faces. Our bylaws exist to protect the value and integrity of our community. But a community is not just a collection of houses with matching mailboxes. A community is people. And if our rules prevent us from acting with basic human decency, then our rules are wrong. The room was dead silent. Therefore, he announced, I am proposing 2 immediate actions. First, I propose the creation of a Community Accessibility Fund, seeded with a donation from my own family to assist residents with ADA-compliant modifications. Second, I am forming a new committee, a proper committee of residents, to review and revise our bylaws to ensure they are not just legally compliant, but compassionate. He looked directly at Brenda. Brenda, as a retired nurse and a good neighbor, I would be honored if you would lead that committee. Brenda's jaw dropped, but she recovered quickly, nodding with a determined look. I accept, Richard. When Davenport called for a vote on the proposals, a chorus of ayes filled the room. It was unanimous. For the first time in a long time, the clubhouse felt less like a courtroom and more like a gathering of neighbors. The change was almost immediate. The next morning, a local contractor, a man whose own father had been a Vietnam veteran, knocked on Frank's door. He'd been at the meeting. He offered to design and build a new, fully compliant composite ramp for Frank, free of charge, as the first project of the new community fund. Frank, stunned, simply nodded his thanks. Over the next week, Willow Creek transformed. The fundraiser for the Accessibility Fund was a wild success. Neighbors who had only ever offered a polite wave now stopped by Frank's house to chat, to offer to pick things up from the store, or to simply say they were glad he was there. The contractor and his team built a beautiful new ramp, a handsome structure in a warm cedar color with elegant, sturdy railings. It looked like it had always belonged there. A few weeks later, Frank was sitting on his new ramp in the warm evening air, a glass of iced tea resting on the arm of his wheelchair. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He watched as Richard Davenport, on his evening stroll, approached his house. Davenport didn't walk past this time. He stopped at the base of the ramp. "Looks good, Frank," he said, a genuine smile on his face. "It's perfect, Richard. Thank you," Frank replied. "No," Davenport said, looking from the ramp to the man sitting on it. "Thank you?" The ramp between them was no longer a symbol of conflict. It was a victory monument, subtle, sloped, and strong. A week later, at the next HOA board meeting, Richard Davenport made one final motion: to resign. There were no objections, no applause either, just silence and a quiet understanding that the right thing had finally been done. In his place, Brenda was unanimously elected interim president. Her first order of business: introducing a new amendment to the bylaws, exempting accessibility structures from aesthetic review, and naming it the Frank Miller Provision. That weekend, neighbors gathered in Frank's yard, not to argue about compliance, but to help stain the new ramp. Someone brought lemonade. Leo played guitar. Brenda baked her famous peach cobbler. Even the Hendersons, whose garden gnome had once sparked a minor HOA feud, brought folding chairs. Frank sat back in his chair, the sun warm on his face, his ramp gleaming in cedar brown, and watched as his neighbors laughed, worked, and talked like old friends. No measuring tapes, no warning letters, just people. And for the first time since returning from Iraq, Frank Miller didn't feel like he had to fight to belong. He was already home.